Photoshop is one of the most useful programs for photo manipulation. A big reason why it's such a useful program is due to the sheer number of different ways you can perform the same action using a variety of different methods. So let's take a look at 10 different ways you can make a selection in Photoshop. Depending on how new you are to Photoshop, you may or may not know how to use the selection tool. So let's start there. So here we have the shape selection tool. So we're going to just click and drag, and let's say this is our subject, and we want this subject to be put onto a different background. And I wish I had a better picture, but this is what we're going to be using. So this is the easiest way. I just hit Control X there to cut it out. This is the easiest way to make a selection, although it's not the end all be all. We still need to do some other things to it. Here's the scene that we're going to be putting myself into. So if we just hit Control V, we now have myself in this new scene. And I'm just going to make myself a little bit smaller there. You know what? I'm just going to say this now. This isn't going to be a very good example of compositing things. We're just looking at selection here, so don't make fun of me. The shape selection tool is usually what I find myself using to isolate subjects from a picture, which is what I did here. I isolated myself. This is just a good way of cutting out the majority of the image so that you don't have to just take your eraser and like make it really big and just erase everything else until you get like a somewhat accurate outline like that. You don't have to do that. You could just use the selection tool. So now we're going to go a little bit further, and we're going to move on to the next selection tool, which is the Lasso tool. If we use this and we click and drag, you will see that this will give you the option to draw your own outline. I'm not really trying to get too close to the edges. I'm just trying to get more of that background that we don't want deleted. So I'm just gonna one thing you can do is hit Control Shift I after you've made a selection, and then that will select everything else other than what you selected. That'll invert the selection, so then you can just hit delete and everything will be deleted that's outside of the selection that you just made. Now you're just going to have to go and erase the edges like so, and this could take a little while depending on how large your image is that you're trying to get composited. So I'm just going to speed this portion up. Alright, so I've gone ahead and erased the outline. So now usually what you're just gonna have to do is you're gonna have to take the eraser tool and get rid of the edges manually. Let's say you don't want to erase anything, so I'll repaste myself, do a little rough outline once more. Another way you can achieve the same thing with more control is by using the polygon lasso tool, which will allow you to just click anywhere and it adds a point. And then if you add another point somewhere else, it'll connect the lines, and you can create a selection this way. And this way it lets you get a whole lot closer to the edges than you might normally do with just the regular lasso tool. So I'm just gonna spend a little bit of time doing this as well. Okay, so I've now just finished my selection with the polygon lasso tool. I'm just gonna hit Control Shift I again and delete everything else along here. The only downside to the polygon lasso tool is rigid edges like that. Instead of just doing that selection, you can just get used to clicking more often and following the contour of the subject. So you still get relatively rounded edges. It's just there's a lot more points that you're creating. Like that looks a lot better. So just keep that in mind when you're using that tool. And there's one more as well. It's the magnetic lasso tool, which is essentially the same thing as the other lasso tools, where you can draw your own outlines, but it automatically finds an edge. Just based on the changes of colors, it can find edges. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it does. Right now it's having some issues. I never use this just because it's so inaccurate. You can get a much better selection just by doing it manually, but that is the magnetic lasso tool in case you ever want to use that. Okay, so now I have been relatively successfully composited on top of this background, even though I don't have any shadows or anything, and the lighting might not be entirely right. The composition is just kind of boring, so let's find something else to put in there. So luckily for us, I've found an example. At least I thought I did. Oh no, I don't have it anymore. Hang on. So we've got the scorpion, and I'm going to try and select it with our fourth selection tool, which is the magic wand. And basically what the magic wand does is it selects a pixel, and then it detects the color and selects any other adjacent pixels that are the same color. So if I select the background and I click on it, then it's going to select all of the pixels that are the exact same color. It's going to keep going until it hits a pixel that's not the same color. So that's why none of this got selected. So now we have an automatic outline of the scorpion. So if I hit delete, then as you can see, it's going to get rid of all the white. Now we do have a problem here because there's these patches of white that have been left, and that's just because they're enclosed. Since they're enclosed, what you could do is just uncheck contiguous, select again, then we can see that all of these holes have been selected as well as the background everywhere else. So now we can just select all with Control A, Control C to copy, and Control V to paste. Gonna desaturate that a little bit, and then I'm going to flip it horizontally, and now it's looking at me. There we go. I'm about to be eaten by a scorpion. This is very nice, very nice. Just like the lasso tool, there is another kind of magic selection tool, and it's the quick selection tool, or I like to call it the selection brush. What this tool does is it just allows you to draw over certain portions of the image, and it does the same thing that the magic wand tool does. It finds adjacent pixels that are the same color and selects those as well. So if we just keep dragging along this background, we're selecting more and more of the background without actually selecting it all. The downside with this tool is that it's not very smart. It's not as smart as the magic wand tool, because the magic wand tool doesn't have to do as much work as this one does. This one can kind of get confused. Yeah, I don't really use that one too much, to be honest. I like to use the magic wand tool more often. I wouldn't really use the quick selection tool unless you're just trying to get a rough outline of a subject without doing the whole lasso thing. So you essentially know all the basic selection methods that will work in most situations, but we still have 5 more. So now we're going to get a little bit more advanced. Here we have another element, and we can see it's got some round edges. So here's a new way that we're going to make a selection. We're going to use the pen tool. And for those of you who have never used the pen tool before, essentially what it does, if you click anywhere, it's going to make a point. If you click and drag, it'll make a point along with some handles that you can use. And what these handles will do, if we make another point here, you'll see it creates a curve. And depending on how far out you drag these handles, you can make the curve look different. You can change the way that it is curved. Now I'm holding Control. If I just left clicked again, it's going to create another point. So you got to hold Control in order to actually move these things. And then you can also move the points as well by holding Control, which is really helpful. With the other selection tools like the lasso tool, you can't really stop and change the selection that you've made while you're making it. This you can. So now that I've got this point selected, I can move on to this side here, and then I can do this here. Now what you're gonna have to do is go over to fill. If it is filled with a color, just go up here to fill and select this little red slash, and that'll make sure there's no filled no filled color. So now we can right click this, make selection, and we won't change anything here. We'll just hit OK, and now we have a selection. So now, making sure we have our background selected, I'm going to hit Control C and then Control V here, and now we have a UFO. That's how you would use the pen tool in order to make a selection. If you've never used it before, it can take a while to get used to it. It can help eliminate some of the steps, but it can also take the same amount of time if you aren't very quick. Okay, now here's a method that I was excited to actually get to. This is something I originally learned how to utilize in video editing, but it can be more useful in photo manipulation. This scene that we have here, we have a sunset, a cloudless sky, and we have some trees in the foreground. Very nice looking. I would prefer it have clouds though. Now the reason why it's going to be difficult to get these clouds in this shot is because both the trees and the background are going to be very hard to select individually. So for instance, this is a gradient. If I want to select it with the magic wand tool, can't do that because there's a bunch of different colors and they're all smudged together. And then similarly with this tree, there's a lot of edges, there's a lot of individual leaves that we'd have to try and select. It's just going to look bad. So both of these elements, the background, the sky, and the trees, are just going to be inconvenient to select by themselves. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify the image by copying, pasting the background, putting it on top of this layer here. Image, adjustments, threshold, and I'm going to turn this about here. So I'm going to hit OK there. Now what this has done, the darkest parts of the image have been made pure black, and the lightest parts of the image have been made entirely white. And what we did there with that moving of the knob was determining what parts were the lightest parts and what parts were going to be considered the darkest parts. And that determines how much of it's black and how much of it's white. Now, if we go ahead and use the magic wand tool to select all this black part, and then we go ahead and hit Control-Shift-I to invert this selection, and then add a mask onto this cloud layer, as you could see, now this cloud layer has been cut to not include the leaves. So now the leaves can be seen through the cloud layer, and if we just choose a different overlay like this, look at that. And now we do have this spot up here. We can see there was this part up here. What we can do to fix that is just go to this mask, just take an eraser, and get rid of this top part. It's that simple. There we go. I mean, you could do some more stuff with the clouds to make it blend better. So like if I wanted to change color balance to make it look more orangey, I could do that. And then I could also, if I wanted to, change the curves a little bit, and that already looks really nice. Now, just the fact that it's an overlay and not an actual, it's not actually in the scene, some parts up here don't look very nice, but it doesn't really matter all that much. It looks pretty good for this example. The main reason why that selection method really worked is because we have so much contrast between the background and the leaves of this tree here, and also this mountain line as well. If you have a picture that does not have a whole lot of contrast in it, I would not use this method. But if you do have a picture with a lot of contrast, this could work if you want something to appear like it's behind something else. I think that turned out pretty well. Yeah, I would say so. You will know when to use that and when not to use that. So now you know. And now I'm going to stay on this image for the last two selection methods. So we have color range. The cool thing about this method is not only that it will make a selection of whatever color you pick, but you can also change the blurriness or the fuzziness of the edges of the selection. Turn the fuzziness to about here. I've selected like these orangey yellowish colors here. If I were to take a brush, as you can see, it makes like a gradient. You see that gradient that's happening? That's insanely cool, I think. Look at that. It makes a gradient for you. I think that's really cool. So use that whenever you think it may apply to the situation. You're gonna know better than I'm gonna know whether or not you need to use that. And finally, the last tool is focus area. Now, I know almost nothing about this method. All I know is what I tinkered with before the video started. I've never used this. I just wanted to find another selection method so I could have an even number to put in the title of this video. But basically what it does is it detects images in the scene. So for instance, it detected this tree and it outlines them and it cuts everything else out. And whatever is white, I believe, is not going to be in the selection. And then whatever is showing in this window, if we go back, the trees are going to be selected. Now you can, this isn't really a useful feature in and of itself. As you can see, it usually doesn't do a good job selecting the edges of objects. Like you can still see, obviously, there's a lot of background still there. But what is somewhat useful is it gives you these two tools here, focus area, subtract, and add tool. And you can bring back parts of the image that aren't selected. And if there's parts that you don't want selected that are, you can use the subtract tool to get rid of those parts. And you can just keep messing with this and get the selection exactly how you want. Not very useful, if I'm being honest, but it is there if you feel like you want to use it. Well, there you have it. There's 10 ways to make selections in Photoshop. I'm sure there are numerous other ways to make selections that I don't know about, but regardless, I hope you found these ones useful. And yes, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you again very soon. Take care.